when we think about where California is right now, I sometimes think of, if you remember some of those old silent movies, with the comedic stuff where you'll have someone who starts walking into a wall over and over again, and eventually figures out that maybe you shouldn't walk into that wall and you should do something different. Eventually the bruise is big enough that you're like, you know what, I'm not going to walk into the wall anymore, I'm going to walk through the door. I sometimes sort of think that California is in that kind of situation. And I think we're finally getting to the point in a number of areas where we're going to stop walking into the wall and we're going to go through the door and do it the old-fashioned way. Recognize a problem and actually solve it. And so I think right now in our state, we're at a turning point or an inflection point in a number of critical areas. And some of those areas, we are at the very beginning of the turning point. Some of them we're deeper in, but they're all big problems with real solutions, but sometimes they're politically hard. I know that water is a huge issue for our entire state, and particularly in San Luis Obispo County and the entire Central Coast. And you were at the tail end of coming out of the drought, and maybe the first to go back in once the drought starts again, because we know that it will come back. The drought is not a temporary isolated condition in California. It's really the normal with some interruptions when we have some wet winters. And we, in California, really have a water system that was designed 150 years ago, as our former secretary knows, and that we have not always been nimble in modernizing it, and to recognize that we're no longer a state of a few million people, that we're a state of 40 million, heading towards 50 million people, and we have to think about water differently. So we are finally starting to take more aggressive strides around water recycling and other ways of being more efficient with the water that we have, and finally acknowledging that we need to stop viewing water as an unlimited resource as we then suffer through the next drought. That there are ways to use water in a better way so that we can have better sustainability. For a long time, and not just California, but everywhere in this country, we forgot about infrastructure. It's like we built it all, and then we sort of forgot about it. And you can forget about it for a while, and it's all good, but then it's not so good anymore, and it becomes an accelerating, you hit a tipping point. And we've seen that with our roads and our highway system and our public transportation system. In the Bay Area, we built this beautiful thing called BART and then forgot about it for a long time, and then it started falling apart, and we've had to fix it. And that's happened in a lot of parts of the states. We've seen it with our schools as well, our school facilities, which are just terrible in so many areas of the state. But we are starting to turn that around. We made the largest transportation investment in the history of California with Senate Bill 1, $5 billion a year in new transportation investment for roads, highways, and public transportation. And then there's housing. And that's an area where we are just, I think, starting to see a turnaround. And it is a hard issue. Water's really hard. I've learned that coming into the legislature. The water wars are notorious, but housing is on a different level. You know, what that shows, whether the people in this room or the protesters outside, or the people living in their cars, housing is a really important issue. And it is, you know, other than maybe air and water, it's right up there as sort of the basis for everything else, because you can't have a successful society unless people have a place to live. That, we have to always remember that. We get very, very technical when it comes to housing debates. We have debates about zoning and CEQA and streamlining and conditional use and general plans and housing elements and local control and state control. All of these super technical terms. And if you go out and get out of sometimes the bubble that some of us get in terms of insider politics and people who go to neighborhood association meetings, people who are really engaged and deep in it, if you get outside of that into the general community, most people, they may not know what those terms mean, and frankly, they don't care. And they don't care who is fixing the housing problem. They don't care if it's that person that they voted on where it said state senate or state assembly next to their name on the ballot, or if it's that person where it said city council member next to their name. They don't care whether it's being fixed at the state level or the local level. They just want it to be fixed. Because, again, they're not thinking in terms of zoning and CEQA and housing elements. What they're thinking about is the fact that their kid can't move back home after college unless they're going to live in the basement, because there's nowhere where their kid is possibly going to be able to live in the community where they grew up, so they're going to go and live in Denver now. What they know is that their 7th grader has a classmate who wakes up in a car every morning, because 5%, 1 out of 20 school children in the state of California is homeless. And that is a moral outrage. And that is what we have come to as a state because of our approach to housing. What they know is that their neighbors down the street had a 2nd or a 3rd kid, and so couldn't live in that small apartment or small house anymore and needed more space, and there was nothing they could afford. So their neighbor, who they've maybe lived near for 5 or 10 years and their kids play with, they're now moving to Denver or Portland or Austin, or maybe if they're in LA, are now moving to San Bernardino so they can commute 2 hours each way to work and spew carbon in the air and mess up their back and get home at night after their kid's already at bed. We're creating a new class of super commuters, people who are commuting 3, 4, 4.5 hours every day because there's nowhere for them to live. What they know is that they wake up in the morning and see homeless people outside who aren't mentally ill, who aren't addicted to drugs, but there is simply no housing for them. So that's what the people see. And when you look at the polls, whether it's statewide or otherwise, again, it's not about local control or state control. It's about fix the darn problem and make it so that people can afford to live here, and make it so that people don't have to commute 2 hours to work, and make it so that children are not living in cars or homeless shelters or in rundown motels where they're moving to a different place every night. That's what people want. And so I say that because we have these fights on housing about whether it should be local control or state control. And I think that that argument is besides the point. It's about what's going to get the job done. And for 50 plus years, really forever in California, we have had a system where local communities have almost pure local control over whether any housing gets built, and if so, how much. Pure local control about whether apartment buildings are legal in a community, or whether the only form of housing that's legal to build are single-family homes. Total control over whether low-income housing is allowed in their community, whether we're going to have income diversity. So we've had this system, and where are we? We have a 3.5 million home housing deficit in California. And to put that in context, that's equal to the housing deficit in the other 49 states combined. One state, California, is 1/2 of the housing deficit of the entire state of California. And that's because we have put policies in place really designed to lead to a housing shortage. And so it's time for the state to set some standards, to actually have rules in place to recognize that housing is a statewide issue, that our economy will not continue to prosper unless workers have a place to live, that we will not meet our housing goal, our climate goals as a state unless we allow people to live closer to where they work and to access public transportation. So that's the work we've been doing the last few years in the legislature. And it's been a diverse effort. As you heard, I authored legislation a few years ago to streamline housing approvals in cities that are not meeting their housing goals. So we now have projects that it used to take 3, 4, 5 years to approve that are now being approved in 3 to 6 months, including quite a bit of 100% affordable housing projects that are just flying through the process because we desperately need that housing. We have beefed up some of our existing laws to make sure that cities are actually complying with their own zoning and are approving projects and not arbitrarily rejecting them or chopping them in half, the Housing Accountability Act. We have strengthened our ADU or in-law unit requirement to say that when we say that cities must allow people to put in-law units in their homes, that we mean it, that you have to do it. And then I am authoring, as other protesters can tell you, Senate Bill 50, which last year was Senate Bill 827. And if no one's protesting what you're doing, then it's not strong enough. And I say that because if you want to accomplish real change, you're going to make some people upset. But sometimes you have to spark hard conversations, because this has been floating under the surface for a long time, and we're trying, more than anything, just to surface it and have that discussion. And so Senate Bill 50 addresses what I mentioned before with low-density zoning, where we have huge swaths of California where it is illegal to build anything other than a single-family home. I grew up in a single-family home. It was a great childhood. Nothing against single-family homes. It's not about getting rid of single-family homes. It's about whether we should only have single-family homes. And not everyone can afford a single-family home. And when you look at our job centers and your transit in particular, it's not sustainable to only allow single-family homes. We want more and more people to be able to live where they work, and when you ban apartment buildings, you're inherently saying not that many people can live in this area. So we are, I think, going to be doing some good things this year. In addition to zoning reform, we're going to increase what we invest in affordable housing. We are going to really make sure that we can have a bright housing future for everyone. I'm an optimist. These conversations are really, really hard. But I think we can get there if we have the political will to have a bright housing future for our kids and for our grandkids, and make sure that California can continue to be the beacon of creativity that has defined this great state for 170 years now. So thank you very much.